Everyone knows that the greatest PS1 game of all time is Chris Kamara's Street Soccer. But did you know that you could make your own PS1 games at home as long as you had a specific bit of kit, and that those controller symbols actually do mean something? Here's more on those and a bunch of other PS1 factos you may not know. One, those Rascals Atari tried to stop the $2.99 launch. Poor Atari. By the middle of the 90s, the console manufacturer was all but an afterthought. The portable Lynx was long gone. The Jaguar had its somewhat demented fans, but really didn't have any hope in hell of catching up to Nintendo or Sega. So when Sony announced their PlayStation was on the horizon, Atari decided the last thing they needed was another company thoroughly kicking their arse. In a 1995 interview with Next Generation, Atari head Sam Tramiel made it clear that they would not accept Sony launching their PS1 for $299 in the West after a $500 launch in Japan. We'll do whatever we can to have the ITC, that's the International Trade Commission of the United States by the way, to go after them. That's called dumping. When asked what he thought a fair price for a PlayStation might be, Sam replied, $500. Now guys, you'll never guess how much Sony launched the PS1 for. Go on, have a little guess. It's pretty good value for the promise that Fight for Life would never ever launch on it. And the second fact is that the PS1 and PS2 were sort of cross-platform, slightly, for like a minute. Nowadays, it's not at all strange to see a major title get a release on both generations of a company's console, and while the PlayStation 1 wasn't the first console to get cross-platform games from its powerful successor, the practice was still an uncommon one when the PS2 came out in 2000. Nevertheless, a small handful of games were developed for not only the shiny new PS2, but also for the PS1 as well. The first two games in the Harry Potter series, the third and fourth entries in the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater franchise, two of those beloved Army Men titles, and Wild Arms are among releases that made it to both systems. So how do they compare? Well, about as well as you'd think really, but the PS1 versions are still, in most cases, a good bit of fun to play. Still, be sure to treat yourself to the nightmare fuel that is Hagrid on the PS1 version of Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. He looks how I feel when you pick on me for saying free instead of free. Number 3, the PS1's answer to the Nintendo Power Glove. Remember Nintendo's Power Glove? It was so bad. Unfortunately, besides being a line from our favourite 90-minute Nintendo commercial of all time,
I love the Power Glove. It's so bad.
That was also a good way to describe the glove itself. Guys, it was a real shitter. Reality Quest, meanwhile, tried to do something a little more effective and viable in the late 90s for the PS1 and later the N64, and from the sound of contemporary reviews, it worked. After fitting the glove to your right hand and fixing it to your hand with Velcro straps, the Reality Quest glove worked by using wrist motions for horizontal or vertical movement. Your 4 main action buttons can be found under 3 fingers, and it's clear that this controller was a viable option for those who couldn't play with traditional controllers for one reason or another. However, for everyone else, the glove just couldn't fully replicate the traditional controller experience, and it was a bit of a flop. Number 4, Net Yaroze ruled. Described as a hobbyist game console, Sony's Net Yaroze is fascinating to examine in retrospect. This all-in-one kit was available at retail, and it did indeed let you create your very own PS1 games. Wow, sort of. The Net Yaroze was a very stripped-down version of the actual developer kit that was given to companies like Square or Capcom. Despite its limited scale, it did allow many young programmers and creators to cut their teeth with tools that could create games, and Sony even created a forum in which developers could share projects and get advice. Some of those people have actually gone on to actual industry careers including Mitsuru Kamiyama, who has worked on numerous games for Square Enix over the past 20 years. The sharp black exterior of the Net Yaroze looks pretty dang cool, but it couldn't actually play PS1 games. However, if you were to make a game on the Net Yaroze and burn it to a CD, your PS1 would run your creation just fine. Numero the 5th, the first 100 million selling console. Just How dominant was the original PlayStation? Well, it was the first video game system to hit 100 million in sales. That's right, the very first. The Jaguar just missed out. In fact, the original PlayStation Yaroze is still the 6th best-selling console of all time. That's impressive, and it underscores why Sony's new kid on the block destroyed Sega and put Nintendo on the ropes. Sony has been a major player in the console wars. Console wars. Ever since. By comparison, the Nintendo 64 has sold approximately 32 million units, while the Sega Saturn ended its short lifespan with less than 10 million. The PS1 distinguished itself with a massive library of must-have games like Tomb Raider, Final Fantasy VII, Ridge Racer, Lion and the King, Tekken, and the list goes on and on and on. If you're not sick of me going on and on and on, you can watch more PS1 videos on our channel. There's even a playlist for it. Go on the page and it's there. Wow. You can have any favourite you want from this generation of consoles, but you have to admit it's not hard to understand why the PlayStation was the first to achieve the massive honour of 100 million sales. Number 6. One of the best CD players ever made? Question mark. The PlayStation 1 didn't just play video games, don't you know, though most of us probably do know that your PlayStation could also play audio CDs. For all of you Phantom Taxers and baby Gronks out there watching this, a CD is a compact disc and it goes inside things, and noises and visuals happen quite a lot of the time. That's exciting. The interface on PS1 was a little odd, as was running everything with your PS1 controller, but it could play any music CD you had on hand. I was particularly keen on Chocolate Salty Balls on repeat. But what you may not know is that audiophiles contend to this day that the PS1 absolutely kicks ass at playing audio CDs as they are meant to be heard. The PS1 was even described in one article as offering a smooth, non-digital sound that seemed to take all of the rough edges off digital replay of the day, replacing them with a soft, burnished glow, whatever any of those words mean in conjunction with one another. You can even use your own audio CDs in whippers like a fib ribbon to make levels. That's pretty dang sick. Number 7, you probably do know this one. The PS1 revolutionized saving your vidigams. Saving your game used to be kind of a massive, gigantic pain in the prostate. Things got better with consoles like the NES in the 3rd generation, but saving capabilities were still extremely limited. Some games demanded the use of a password, and that always had the potential to become a small nightmare of memorization and writing down what could sometimes be dozens of characters. Who came up with this? Pepe Sylvia? External storage was clearly the solution for the future, and the PS1 was the first system to offer something robust and even groundbreaking in this regard. However, what you may not know is that they weren't the first major console to launch with external storage capabilities, as that would be SNK's Neo Geo in 1990. However, the Neo Geo card only gave you 2 kilobytes worth of storage. For context, me saying half of one of these syllables is probably about 10 times that much amount of storage needed. The PS1 memory card offered 128 kilobytes, which is probably this sentence broken up into 15 blocks for saving a plethora of games. It still wasn't enough sometimes. Rest in peace my NHL 98 career mode save that I had to keep deleting every 5 minutes to make way for small soldiers, but it ushered in a new era of data storage for consoles. Number 8, Sony's first major release was... One of the reasons why the PS1 was a massive success came down to Sony partnering up with some of the best developers and publishers in the world. They struck a particularly lucrative deal with Namco for games like Tekken and Ridge Racer, but really, Sony developed good working relationships with pretty much everyone apart from all the mortal enemies they had developed in no time at all. This ensured the PS1 would have a library unlike anything before it, really. But what about Sony as a developer and publisher themselves? What was their first major release as a developer? If you've never heard of a 1994 game called Motor Toon Grand Prix, that's fair, really. Somewhat obscured by time despite doing well enough to get a pretty good sequel in 1996. Mototoon Grand Prix was directed by Kazunori Yamauchi and developed by the Polis Entertainment team, and follows a grieving widower as he attempts to connect with his son on a journey up a mount. Oh, sorry, that's God of War, my bad. No, this has got cars in it. Yeah, it's got cars. Yamauchi, and indeed most of Polis, would later be the legendary group behind the first Gran Turismo, which we're willing to bet is a game you have heard of. Number 9, those dang black discs. It would be easy to assume that PlayStation 1 discs were black for purely aesthetic reasons, because they do look pretty damn cool, since Sony was positioning their console as the coolest thing humanity had ever done. That might be part of the reason, as we'll never fully know for sure, but we do know that a big part of this decision almost certainly concerned piracy fears. One of the big advantages of cartridges was how difficult it was to pirate them. Disc technology may have been able to contain the multitudes of a Final Fantasy 7, 8 or the Fifth Element, but it was also considerably easier to copy whatever was on the data side and also scratch them through the sheer power of thought. It's often believed that Sony thought that the black ink added an element of difficulty to pirating the games, but there's no evidence this ever actually worked. Even as the black discs gave official PS1 games a distinct look, eventually blank black discs were released to retail anyway. Try saying that 3 times fast. Blank, black, blank, black, blank, black. Everyone knew at least one person who had a chipped PS1 back in the day. If you did, let us know down below. Note, for legal reasons, Culture Vultures cannot say that we will and will not turn over this information to the relevant authorities for sums of money. Listen, I need to be able to afford JoJo's Bizarre Adventure on PS1 some way, okay? Number 10, the controller symbols mean something. Times may change, technology certainly changes, hairlines change. But even Sony knows better than to mess with the iconic symbols associated with not only their controllers but with their very brand and identity. Modern PS5 controllers continue to utilise the triangle, circle, X, square symbols on a 4-button design, and no, it's not cross. It's not a cross, it's X, alright? And it's not O, it's circle. It is circle, okay? Don't start in the comments. I'm not having it. I'm not having it today. Many people don't really think about what these symbols might mean, but it was recently uncovered in an old interview with PlayStation 1 designer Teiyu Goto that the symbols and their corresponding colours all have meaning and purpose. Basically, the triangle is green and represents viewpoint, square is pink and refers to menus and documents in the game, circles are red and represent a yes, while the X is blue and represents a no. It's ingenious when you stop to think about it, and while PS5 DualSense controllers don't have the colours, we all just kind of know which each one is supposed to do by this point, and that's kind of great. On a separate note, who else remembers when triangle was almost always back? It always will be to me. Number 11, Sony and Sega. Much like the story of Atari nearly coming to terms on releasing the NES stateside, Sega had an opportunity to work with a company that was looking to break into the video game console business, and it didn't work out. And by it didn't work out, we mean that Sega flat out refused to even consider the notion of collaborating with Sony on a console project. More specifically, Sega of Japan rejected a proposal brought forth by Sega of America President Tom Kalinske to join with Sony to create what would be called the Sega Multimedia Entertainment System. That's right, the SMES or SMES. I love that. Sony doesn't know how to make hardware, Kalinske later said the company told him. Perhaps that was a fair assertion in 1991, but it was nevertheless a decision that would come back to haunt the company when Sony started rocking their shit hard in 1995 and never looked back. Just think, we could have had Sonic Cross Knack if Sega was just a little bit braver. Hey, by the way, we also have a Sega playlist with all our Sega videos on our channel as well. Go do that, watch that. Also, afterwards. Keep watching this though. Number 12, video CDs were a thing. One of the biggest reasons why the PS2 absolutely slaughtered its competition coincided with the rise of DVD technology and the release of the Bouncer. Don't look that up. The PlayStation 2 offered DVD playback in a package that was cheaper than virtually any dedicated DVD player currently available. It made sense for Sony to tap into the media playback potential of the console, as they had done something similar with the PS1 and video CD technology to, not great results, and it's not because it couldn't play Van Wilder. It's commonly known that the PS1 could play music CDs in addition to your standard video games. While the PS1 obviously couldn't play DVDs, one specific model of the console could, sort of. The ultra-rare SCPH-5903 PlayStation could handle video CD playback, although keep in mind that the video CD format tanked in most parts of the world because it was more expensive than VHS and roughly the same level of video and audio quality. Why did you bother? It's also worth noting that this model of PlayStation is very hard to find, with around 10,000 or so of them in existence in total. Number 13, the last PS1 game ever came out 1 year before the Xbox 360. If you wanted to stay loyal to the PS1 and only the PS1 throughout the 2000s, you could count on getting at least a small stream of games up to the middle of the decade. Although most of the world left the PlayStation 1 behind for the PS2 and other entries in the 6th console generation, developers continue to release some questionable titles for the console. This includes several sports games and some god-awful kids games that even children would likely hate. However, the last licensed PS1 game to ever be released in North America was FIFA 2005 in October 2004, making it just a year older than the Xbox 360 and younger than the best movie of all time, Kung Fu Hustle. Developed and published by EA, the game was released to seemingly every platform that could handle it, which is pretty standard for FIFA even today, or EA Sports FC as it will never ever be known. The game even came out on N-Gage and Gizmondo. This might have been why the game sold extremely well upon release. The last game ever released for the PS1 though seems to be the Japan exclusive re-release of Strider Hiryu from Capcom, who released the game months after Sony officially ended support for the console way back in October 24th, 2006. For a bit of context, the PS3 came out 1 month later. Number 14, Nintendo vs Sony, the Drake and Kendrick of the 90s. Sony had been trying to get into video game hardware for quite some time before the release of the PlayStation in 1994. While we don't know how long a Sony and Nintendo partnership would have lasted if it worked out for the Nintendo PlayStation, we do know that when Sony excitedly announced its venture with Nintendo at the CES Chicago event in 1991, Nintendo responded by announcing that they were dropping Sony to work with Philips instead. Bloody hell, Nintendo, bloody hell. But the game hardware giants were perhaps right to be concerned that Sony might have had an unfair advantage in their union. Ken Kutaragi from Sony later made it clear that he hoped the work with Nintendo would eventually lead to Sony starting to manufacture their own systems. Peace really never was an option, eh? Unfortunately, Nintendo's effort to push Sony away backfired in spectacular fashion. Sony Computer Entertainment, the company that would eventually put the PlayStation in stores, was literally created by Sony president Norio Oga as an FU response to Nintendo's unexpected treachery. Honestly, we absolutely love Nintendo, but they were absolute lunatics in the 90s, and it was always a treat to see someone snap back, and you know, the industry is better for Sony being in it, so you don't want a monopoly, do you? It's also a treat to see what the SNES PlayStation actually looked like too. Would you like to see this incident on a Nintendo Mistakes video? Let us know down below. Number 15, the best-selling PS1 game ever took 5 years to develop. Quick, what's the best-selling PS1 game of all time? If you said C12 Final Resistance, you are not correct. But I like your thinking, wishful thinking. If you said Gran Turismo, then you know just how utterly dominant that franchise was on the PS1. There were plenty of million-selling games, but only one made it past the 10 million copies mark, and that's the first entry in one of the most beloved racing sim franchises of all time. Gran Turismo changed the way people thought about racing games, and it's not a huge shock that the success of this game put it at the top in the sales department. The sequel did nearly as well with a little over 9 million copies. The only significant competition comes from Final Fantasy 7 and 8, this is Final Fantasy 9 Erasure and I won't stand for it, and then a little game called Tekken 3. Gran Turismo also took 5 years to get off the ground, which is normal in today's climate, but more distinctive during a time when most games came after a year or two in development. Gran Turismo's story begins in 1992 as one of the countless proposals creator Kazunori Yamauchi offered during the development of the PlayStation console itself. The game's lengthy development time came down to a variety of issues, including working against the limitations of the PlayStation, a small development team that rarely had more than 12 people, and the demands of games like Motor 2 Grand Prix and its sequel. Gran Turismo's very origin is directly tied to the history of its home console, and there's something that just feels right about it being the best-selling PS1 game of all time, even though we all know it should be C12. And that was our video looking at some cool facts and kittens on the original PlayStation. Do you have any cool little factos, any little info dumps, bits of stuff on the original PlayStation? Be sure to let us know down below. I've been Jimmy for Vultures, and thank you for watching. That's 2 outros back to back. I nailed them. Come on.